The scent of burnt biscuits followed Josephine Carter through the dusty streets of Sierra Vista, Arizona, like a persistent shadow she could not shake. And as she clutched her basket of misshapen bread loaves, she wondered if the whispers of the townswomen would ever cease their relentless judgment. It was the summer of 1878, and the Arizona Territory blazed with an unforgiving heat that made even the hardiest souls seek shade. Josephine had arrived in Sierra Vista 3 months prior, an orphan at 22 years old, trying desperately to make a life for herself after losing both parents to typhoid fever back in Missouri. She had inherited a small cottage on the edge of town from a distant aunt she had never met, and with it came the expectations of a community that valued domestic perfection above all else. The problem was that Josephine possessed not a single domestic skill worth mentioning. Her bread rose unevenly or not at all. Her sewing created more holes than it mended. Her attempts at keeping a tidy home resulted in chaos that somehow multiplied despite her best efforts. The other women in Sierra Vista had noticed immediately, and their clucking disapproval had become the constant soundtrack to her existence. "Did you see the state of her laundry yesterday?" Mrs. Henderson whispered loudly enough for half the mercantile to hear. "Gray as dishwater and twice as dingy." "And those biscuits she brought to the church social," Mrs. Pemberton added with a shake of her head. "Hard as river stones. Nearly broke my tooth." Josephine pretended not to hear as she placed her coins on the counter for flour she would inevitably ruin. The shopkeeper, Mr. Willis, gave her a sympathetic smile that only made her feel worse. Pity was almost harder to bear than contempt. She hurried from the store, her face burning with shame that had nothing to do with the desert sun. As she rounded the corner near the livery stable, she collided solidly with what felt like a wall of solid muscle. Her basket went flying, and the misshapen loaves scattered across the dirt like tumbleweeds. "Steady there," a deep voice rumbled, and large hands gripped her shoulders, keeping her upright. Josephine looked up and up, her breath catching in her throat. The man before her stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair fell past his collar in dark waves that looked as though they had been tamed only by his own hands running through them. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw covered in several days of stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore buckskin clothing that had seen hard use, and across his back was strapped a rifle that looked as natural on him as his own skin. I apologize," Josephine stammered, acutely aware of how small she felt next to this mountain of a man. "I was not watching where I was going." "No harm done." He released her shoulders and bent to gather her scattered bread, his movements surprisingly graceful for someone so large. When he straightened and handed her the basket, his brow furrowed slightly. "These for eating or for building a fence?" Despite herself, Josephine felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. It was the first time someone had made a joke about her cooking, rather than simply disparaging it behind raised hands and judgmental eyes. "I was attempting the former, though I suppose the latter might be their better use." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Pierce Oakley," he said, extending a hand that dwarfed her own. "Josephine Carter." She placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard labor and harder living. His grip was gentle despite the obvious strength in those fingers. "You are new to Sierra Vista," Pierce said. It was not a question. 3 months now, and you?" "Just passing through. Been up in the mountains trapping all winter and spring. Come down to trade my pelts and stock up on supplies before heading back up." "You live in the mountains?" Josephine asked, fascinated despite herself. She had heard stories of mountain men, those solitary figures who chose wilderness over civilization, but she had never met one. "Been doing it for near about 8 years now. Got a cabin up in the Huachuca Range, about a day's ride from here." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains that rose in the distance, their peaks hazy in the afternoon heat. "Suits me better than town living." Before Josephine could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Josephine Carter, is that you standing in the street conversing with strange men like some common saloon girl?" Josephine closed her eyes briefly, recognizing Mrs. Henderson's voice. When she opened them, she saw the older woman bearing down on them with Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Tucker in tow, like a trio of disapproving vultures. "Mr. Oakley and I simply collided by accident," Josephine explained, her cheeks flaming. "He was helping me retrieve my things." Mrs. Henderson's eyes swept over Pierce with obvious distaste, taking in his rough clothing and wild appearance. "I see. Well, you best come along now. There is work to be done, and you have already fallen behind on your duties for the church supper this evening." "I have not forgotten," Josephine said quietly. "Have you prepared your dish?" Mrs. Pemberton asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer would be disappointing. "I made bread." The three women exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Mrs. Tucker, who had been silent until now, sighed heavily. "Perhaps you might contribute by helping with the cleaning instead, dear. We would not want a repeat of last month's social." Josephine felt her throat tighten with humiliation. She was acutely aware of Pierce standing beside her, witnessing her public shame. "Of course, whatever you think best." "She cannot keep house to save her life," Mrs. Henderson said to her companions, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Poor thing. How she expects to ever attract a decent husband is beyond my understanding. Some women simply lack the natural aptitude for domestic matters," Mrs. Pemberton agreed sadly. "It is unfortunate, but there it is." They swept past, leaving Josephine standing frozen in the street, wishing desperately that the ground would open and swallow her whole. She could not bring herself to look at Pierce, certain she would see the same judgment in his eyes that she saw in everyone else's. "Those old hens always so pleasant?" Pierce asked after a long moment. Josephine forced herself to meet his gaze and was surprised to find not contempt, but something that looked almost like anger on her behalf. "They are pillars of the community," she said carefully, "and they are not wrong. I truly am hopeless at all the things a woman should know how to do." "Says who?" "Says everyone. Says the evidence of every burnt meal and crooked seam I have ever attempted." She shifted the basket in her arms. "I should go. Thank you again for your help, Mr. Oakley." She started to walk away, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Carter," she turned back. "Can you shoot?" The question was so unexpected that she blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "A rifle. Can you shoot one?" "I have never tried." "Can you ride?" "A horse?" "Yes, actually. My father taught me when I was young. It is about the only practical skill I possess." "Can you read?" "Of course." "Then you are not hopeless at everything." He adjusted the rifle on his back. "Just means you got different skills than what those women think matters." Something warm unfurled in Josephine's chest at his words, but years of disapproval had taught her not to hope. Different skills do not put food on the table or keep a home running. "Depends on what kind of home you are keeping." Pierce tipped his head in a gesture that might have been a farewell. "Good day, Miss Carter." He walked away toward the trading post, and Josephine stood watching him go, feeling oddly bereft. She shook herself and hurried home to attempt some contribution to the church supper that would not result in additional humiliation. That evening, as she stood in the corner of the church hall scrubbing plates while the other women's perfect pies and roasts received effusive praise, Josephine found her thoughts drifting back to the mountain man with the storm-gray eyes. There had been no pity in his gaze, no condescension, just straightforward acceptance of who she was, flaws and all. It was a feeling so foreign she barely knew what to do with it. The next morning, Josephine woke to shouting in the street. She threw on her wrapper and hurried to the window to see a crowd gathered near the center of town. Heart pounding, she dressed quickly and joined the throng. "What has happened?" she asked Mrs. Willis, the shopkeeper's wife. "The Dawson Ranch was hit by raiders last night," the woman said, her face pale. "They took most of the horses and killed 2 of the ranch hands. Mr. Dawson is putting together a group to go after them." Josephine felt her stomach turn. Violence was not uncommon in the territory, but it never failed to shake her. She watched as men gathered, checking their weapons and preparing to ride. Among them, she spotted Pierce, his tall frame unmistakable even in the crowd. He was speaking with the sheriff, his expression grim. Whatever he said made the lawman nod and clap him on the shoulder. Then, Pierce was swinging up onto a large roan horse with an ease that spoke of years in the saddle. The posse rode out in a cloud of dust, and the women of Sierra Vista were left to wait and worry. Josephine found herself unable to settle to anything. She tried to work on mending a dress but pricked her finger 3 times in as many minutes. She attempted to sweep her cottage but only succeeded in creating clouds of dust that made her cough. Finally, she gave up and sat on her small porch, staring out toward the mountains and wondering why she felt such concern for a man she had spoken to for barely 5 minutes. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Evening fell, and still the men had not returned. Josephine lit a lamp and tried to read, but the words swam before her eyes. When she finally heard the sound of hoofbeats and went to her window, it was full dark. The posse returned with grim faces, but no prisoners. She heard later that they had tracked the raiders to the border, but lost them in the rocky terrain. One of the Sierra Vista men had been wounded, though not seriously. They had recovered some of the stolen horses, which was better than nothing. Josephine did not see Pierce among the returning men and felt a spike of fear. Had he been hurt? Had he simply continued on to his mountain cabin without returning to town? She had her answer 2 days later when she made her weekly trip to the mercantile. Pierce was there, standing at the counter discussing his supply order with Mr. Willis. He had clearly bathed since the chase, his hair still damp and pulled back, and he had shaved, revealing the strong lines of his jaw. "Miss Carter," he said when he noticed her, tipping his head in greeting. "Mr. Oakley, I am glad to see you returned safely. Takes more than a few raiders to cause me trouble." His eyes warmed slightly. "How have you been keeping?" "Well enough," she hesitated, then added, "I heard you helped track them nearly to Mexico." "Followed sign where it led. Wish we could have caught them, but at least we got most of the horses back." He accepted his bundle of supplies from Mr. Willis and turned back to her. "You're managing all right? Those church ladies not giving you too much grief?" The fact that he remembered that he cared enough to ask made something flutter in her chest. "I am surviving. They have given up expecting me to contribute food to any gatherings, which is probably better for everyone involved. Their loss." He shifted the weight of his pack. "I will be heading back up to the mountains tomorrow morning. Stayed longer than I meant to already." Josephine felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "I hope you have a safe journey." Pierce studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that those gray eyes could see straight through to her thoughts. "Do you ever get out of town, Miss Carter? See the country around here?" "Not really. I ride occasionally, but never very far." "Shame. It is beautiful country once you get up into the foothills. There's a waterfall about an hour's ride north of here. Water comes down cold and clear from the high peaks." "It sounds lovely." He nodded slowly, seeming to come to some internal decision. "If you have a mind to see it, you could ride out tomorrow morning early before the heat sets in. Follow the north trail past the old Miller place. Then take the left fork when it splits. Keep following it up into the rocks. You cannot miss the falls once you get close enough." Josephine's heart began to beat faster. Was he suggesting she meet him there, or simply offering information about a nice ride? His expression gave nothing away. "That is very kind of you to share," she said carefully. "Just thinking a woman who can ride ought to take advantage of it now and then. Gets a person out of their head, being in nature." He touched the brim of his hat. "Take care, Miss Carter." He left the mercantile, and Josephine stood staring after him, her mind racing. It would be improper to meet a man alone in the wilderness. The town gossips would have a field day if anyone found out. And yet, the thought of seeing that waterfall, of having even a few more minutes of conversation with someone who did not make her feel like a failure at every turn, was almost overwhelming in its appeal. She barely slept that night, arguing with herself. Propriety said she should stay home. Every cautious bone in her body said riding out alone to meet a near stranger was foolish. But something deeper, some part of her that had been slowly withering under the constant criticism and judgment, whispered that maybe this once she could do something just for herself. Before dawn, Josephine rose and dressed in her riding clothes. She left a note on her table saying she had gone for an early ride in case anyone came looking, though she doubted anyone would notice her absence. She saddled her mare, a gentle chestnut named Penny that had belonged to her aunt, and set out as the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten. The morning air was cool and sweet, a relief from the oppressive heat of midday. Josephine followed Pierce's directions, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The trail climbed gradually into the foothills, winding between stands of mesquite and palo verde trees. Birds were beginning to wake, filling the air with song. She had been riding for perhaps 45 minutes when she heard it, the sound of falling water. The trail turned through a narrow gap between red rocks, and suddenly she was in a small canyon. Water cascaded down a cliff face perhaps 30 feet high, splashing into a pool so clear she could see the stones at the bottom. Ferns and wildflowers grew in the mist around the edges, creating a pocket of lush green in the midst of the desert landscape. Pierce was already there, his horse grazing nearby. He stood near the pool, watching the water, and turned when he heard her approach. "You came," he said, and something in his voice suggested he had not been certain she would. Josephine dismounted, her legs slightly shaky. "I hope I am not intruding. You said anyone who could ride should see this, and I thought perhaps you meant the invitation generally." "I meant it specifically." He walked toward her, moving with that same unconscious grace she had noticed before. "Been thinking about you since I saw those women treating you poorly. Figured you could use a morning away from all that judgment." "You do not even know me," Josephine said softly. "Why would you care?" Pierce stopped a few feet away, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Because I know what it is like to not fit into the box people think you should occupy. And I know what it is like to have people tell you that you are doing life wrong just because you are doing it different from how they do." "Is that why you live in the mountains?" "Part of it. I never did take to town living. Too many rules about how to dress and talk and what matters and what does not. Up in my cabin, I can be myself. Hunt when I want to hunt, read when I want to read, not have to apologize for preferring my own company to forced socializing." "That sounds wonderful," Josephine said wistfully. "I have never felt like I belonged anywhere, certainly not in Sierra Vista." "So why stay? Where else would I go? I have no family left, and a woman alone has few options. At least here I have a roof over my head." Pierce studied her for a long moment. "Come sit with me. Let me show you something." He led her to a flat rock near the pool's edge. The mist from the waterfall cooled the air, and rainbow light danced in the spray. Pierce pulled something from his saddlebag and handed it to her. It was a book, the leather cover worn soft with handling. "You said you can read," he said. "What do you like to read?" Josephine opened the book and found herself looking at poetry. Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley. She looked up at him in surprise. "I would not have expected a mountain man to carry poetry." "Why? Because I live rough means I cannot appreciate beautiful things?" There was no rancor in his voice, just mild amusement. "My mother was a school teacher back in Virginia, before she married my father. She taught me to read before I could barely walk, and she always said that a person's circumstances did not dictate their capacity for learning or beauty." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was. Died when I was 16. My father followed her 2 years later. I tried to keep the farm going for a while, but my heart was not in it. Eventually sold it and headed west. Been moving ever since, until I found my spot up in the Huachucas. That is when I finally felt like I could stop running." Josephine ran her fingers over the book's cover. "My mother loved to read, too. She used to say that books were windows to worlds we might never otherwise see. My father thought it was foolishness, that I should focus on learning to cook and sew and keep house. Mother taught me anyway, in secret." She smiled at the memory. "When I turned out to be hopeless at domestic skills, she told me not to worry, that I had other gifts. But I am beginning to think she was just being kind. Or she was being truthful, and you just have not found the place where your gifts matter yet." Pierce settled on the rock beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "Tell me something you are good at, something you enjoy." Josephine thought for a moment. "I like numbers, arithmetic, bookkeeping. My father ran a dry goods store, and I used to help him with the ledgers. I could always see patterns in the numbers, ways to organize things that made sense. That's a valuable skill. Not in a world where the only thing that matters is whether your biscuits rise properly." "Then maybe you are living in the wrong world." Pierce looked out at the waterfall. "Up in the mountains, what matters is whether you can track game, read weather signs, know how to preserve your meat for winter. Can you start a fire in wet conditions? Can you find water when you need it? Can you defend yourself? Nobody cares if your house is spotless, because surviving matters more than appearing proper. But I do not know how to do any of those things either. You could learn if you wanted to." Josephine turned to look at him, trying to read his expression. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Pierce met her gaze steadily. "Because the moment I saw you standing in that street, trying so hard to be small and invisible while those women cut you down, I saw something in you that I recognized. Spirit, strength, a person doing their best to survive in a situation that is slowly killing them from the inside out." He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture surprisingly tender from such large, rough hands. "And because you are the first person in years who has looked at me and not seen just some wild man to be wary of. You looked at me like I was just a person. That means something." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. She should pull away, remind him of propriety, of proper behavior. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly into his touch. "Pierce, I'm heading back to my cabin tomorrow," he said quietly. "But I come down to town every few weeks for supplies. Would you want to meet me here again next time I come down?" "Yes," Josephine said without hesitation. "I would like that very much." They spent the next few hours at the waterfall, talking about everything and nothing. Pierce told her about his life in the mountains, the changing seasons, the wildlife he encountered, the simple routines that structured his days. Josephine talked about her childhood, her parents, the books she had read and loved. They discussed philosophy and politics, shared opinions on matters both weighty and trivial. The conversation flowed as naturally as the water cascading down the rocks, and Josephine realized she had never in her life felt so comfortable with another person. When the sun climbed higher and the heat began to intensify, Pierce reluctantly said they should head back before anyone wondered where Josephine had gone. They rode together until they neared town. Then Pierce stopped. "Best if we are not seen arriving together," he said. "Would not want to give those gossips more ammunition." "When will you be back?" Josephine asked, trying not to sound as desperate as she felt. 3 weeks, maybe 4 at the most. I will get word to you somehow, let you know when to meet me." "I will be there." Pierce reached out and took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that seemed both courtly and utterly natural coming from him. "Until then, Miss Carter." "Josephine," she said. "Please call me Josephine. Josephine." The way he said her name, soft and deliberate, made her shiver despite the heat. "Take care of yourself." He rode off toward the mountains, and Josephine sat watching until he disappeared from sight. Then she turned Penny toward home, feeling more alive than she had in months. The next 3 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Josephine went through the motions of her daily life, enduring the thinly veiled criticisms and barely concealed disdain of the other women. But now their words rolled off her like water off oiled canvas. She had a secret, a small, bright thing she kept tucked away in her heart, and it sustained her through every cutting comment and disappointed sigh. She reread the book of poetry Pierce had lent her until she could recite entire passages from memory. She practiced her writing, building up her endurance and skill. And she waited. On the 23rd day, a young boy appeared at her door with a note. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. Tomorrow at dawn, same place. Josephine barely slept. She rose even earlier than before, wanting to be sure she arrived at the waterfall on time. When she rode into the small canyon, Pierce was already there, and the smile that split his face when he saw her made her heart feel like it might burst. "I was not sure," he said as she dismounted. 3 weeks is a long time. Thought maybe you might have changed your mind." Not for a single moment. Josephine walked toward him, and when she was close enough, Pierce reached out and pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart under her cheek. They stood that way for a long moment, and Josephine thought this might be what coming home felt like. They fell into a pattern over the following months. Pierce would come down from the mountains every 3 or 4 weeks, and Josephine would meet him at the waterfall. They would spend precious hours together, talking, sharing meals Pierce had packed, exploring the countryside around them. He taught her to read animal tracks, to identify edible plants, to listen to the language of the land. She shared stories from her books, made him laugh with her observations about town life, gradually let him see all the parts of herself she normally kept hidden. And slowly, carefully, they fell in love. It was not a sudden thing, but rather a gradual recognition, like watching the sun rise. One day, Josephine looked at Pierce and realized she could not imagine her life without him in it. that his happiness mattered more to her than her own, that when she thought about the future, every vision included his presence. Pierce was more direct. On a crisp October morning, as they sat by the waterfall watching leaves drift down from the cottonwoods, he took her hand and said simply, "I love you, Josephine. Have for weeks now. Maybe from the first moment I saw you standing in that street, trying to hold your head high while the world tried to make you small." "I love you too," Josephine whispered, the words spilling out of her like water from the falls. "So much that sometimes it frightens me." "Nothing to be frightened of." Pierce lifted her hand to his lips. "Question is, what do we do about it?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm a man who lives alone in the mountains. You are a woman living in town. Those two things do not easily go together." He turned to face her fully. "But I have been thinking about this for weeks now, and I need to know. Would you consider marrying me? Coming to live with me up in my cabin?" Josephine's heart began to race. "Pierce, I cannot cook. I cannot clean properly. I would make a terrible wife." "You would make a terrible wife for most men," Pierce agreed. "But I am not most men. I do not need you to keep a spotless house or make fancy meals. I can cook my own food and clean my own space. What I need is a partner, someone to share my life with, someone to talk to about things that matter, someone who makes me want to come home at the end of the day instead of being content with solitude." "But what would I do? How would I contribute?" Pierce smiled. "You're clever with numbers. I've been keeping my own ledgers for my trapping business, tracking pelts and trades, but I'm no good at it, always losing track of things. You could manage that. And I've been thinking about expanding, maybe building a second cabin to use as a trading post for other trappers who come through. You could help run that, manage the accounts." He cupped her face in his hands. "The point is, we would figure it out together. Build a life that works for us, not one that fits someone else's ideas of how things should be." Tears stung Josephine's eyes. "Are you certain? Once I leave town, there would be no going back. People would talk." "Let them talk. They are already talking about you, saying things that are not true and do not matter. At least this way, you would be living your life on your own terms." Josephine thought about her little cottage in Sierra Vista, the place that had never felt like home. She thought about the women who found fault with everything she did, the endless sense of failure that had become her constant companion. And then she thought about Pierce, about the way she felt when she was with him, free, accepted, cherished for exactly who she was, flaws and all. "Yes," she said, "yes, I will marry you." Pierce let out a whoop of joy that startled birds from the surrounding trees. He lifted her clear off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her, and Josephine felt the entire world shift and realign around this new truth. She was going to be Pierce Oakley's wife. They made plans quickly. Pierce needed to return to his cabin to prepare for winter, but he would come back down in 2 weeks. They would marry quietly, with just a few witnesses, and then Josephine would ride back up to the mountains with him. She would sell her cottage and its furnishings, pack only what was essential. The day Pierce left to return to his cabin, Josephine went back to Sierra Vista feeling light as air. She immediately began sorting through her possessions, deciding what to keep and what to sell. The cottage went quickly once she put word out that she was leaving. A newly married couple bought it, along with most of the furniture. The announcement that she was moving caused quite a stir. The women of Sierra Vista could not decide whether to be scandalized or relieved. Mrs. Henderson made a point of stopping Josephine on the street to express her concerns. "You are marrying this mountain man," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "A man you barely know, who lives like a savage in the wilderness. Do you truly think this is wise?" "I think it is exactly what I need," Josephine replied calmly. "But what kind of life will you have? No society, no church, no proper home." "I will have a life with someone who loves me and values me. That seems rather more important than social events and proper parlors." Mrs. Pemberton, who had joined the conversation, shook her head sadly. "You are making a terrible mistake, my dear. What will you do when you realize you cannot keep house even out there? He will regret marrying you." For the first time in months, Josephine smiled at the older woman with genuine warmth. "Perhaps, but that will be between my husband and me. will it not? Not the business of the entire town? She walked away, feeling triumphant, leaving the women clucking and muttering behind her. Let them talk. In 2 weeks she would be gone, starting a new life far from their judgment and narrow expectations. Pierce returned as promised, riding into Sierra Vista on a cold November morning. He had shaved and put on his best clothes, which were still rough by town standards, but clean and well-maintained. He went directly to the parsonage to speak with Reverend Matthews about performing the ceremony. The Reverend, a kind man in his 60s who had always treated Josephine with gentle respect, agreed readily. I think this is a good match, he told them both. You have both seemed happier these past months than I have seen you. That speaks well. They were married the next morning in the small church, with only Reverend Matthews, his wife, and Mr. and Mrs. Willis in attendance. Josephine wore a simple blue dress, the nicest she owned, and carried a small bouquet of dried wildflowers. Pierce stood straight and tall beside her, his hand engulfing hers as they spoke their vows. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Pierce kissed her with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with tears. This was real. She was truly his wife now, and he was her husband. They spent that night at the boarding house, Pierce insisting that they do things properly. He was tender and patient with her inexperience, making their first night together something beautiful rather than frightening. Josephine fell asleep in his arms, feeling cherished and safe, 2 things she had not felt since her parents died. The next morning, they loaded her belongings onto a pack horse and began the journey up to Pierce's cabin. The ride took most of the day, climbing steadily into the mountains as the air grew cooler and the landscape changed from desert scrub to pine forest. Josephine breathed deeply, feeling tension she had not even known she was carrying begin to ease from her shoulders. Are you nervous? Pierce asked as they paused to rest the horses. A little, Josephine admitted. I want so much for this to work. It will work because we will make it work. Pierce moved his horse closer to hers, reaching out to take her hand. We are a team now, Josephine. Partners. Whatever comes, we face it together. The sun was setting when they finally arrived at Pierce's cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view of the valley spreading out below. The cabin itself was larger than Josephine had expected, solidly built from pine logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Behind it stood a barn for the horses and another smaller outbuilding. It is not fancy, Pierce said, suddenly sounding uncertain. But it is sound and warm, and the roof does not leak. It is perfect, Josephine said honestly. To her eyes, used to her cramped cottage in town, it looked like a palace. Pierce dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist. Welcome home, Mrs. Oakley. Mrs. Oakley. Josephine tested the name silently and found she liked it very much. Inside, the cabin was as solid and practical as everything else about Pierce. One large main room served as kitchen and living area, with a fireplace taking up most of one wall. A ladder led to a loft above, which Pierce explained was where he slept. A door opened to a small second room that he'd been using for storage, but could be converted to whatever she wished. I know it is rough compared to town, Pierce said, watching her face anxiously. But we can fix it up however you like. Josephine turned to him, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hands. Pierce Oakley, I do not care if we are living in a tent made of deer hide. As long as I am with you, I am home. He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and when he lifted her in his arms and carried her to the loft, Josephine went gladly, ready to begin this new chapter of her life. The next weeks were a period of adjustment. Pierce had been honest about his domestic skills, she discovered. He kept the cabin clean and organized with military precision. He cooked simple, hearty meals that stuck to the ribs, even if they would never win any prizes for presentation. He had systems for everything, from wood storage to water hauling, and he taught Josephine each one patiently. For her part, Josephine threw herself into learning. She would never be a good cook, Pierce acknowledged that readily, so he continued to handle most of the meal preparation. But she could learn to preserve meat, to dry herbs, to manage their stores. She took over all the bookkeeping, organizing Pierce's records with an efficiency that made him shake his head in wonder. I have been doing this for 8 years, he told her, looking at the neat ledgers she had created. Never once have I been able to keep track of everything this clearly. You have a gift for this, Josephine." She also discovered that she liked many aspects of mountain living. She loved the solitude, the quiet, broken only by wind and wildlife. She enjoyed learning to read the weather, to identify animal tracks, to understand the rhythms of the natural world. Pierce taught her to shoot, and while she would never be an expert marksman, she became proficient enough to defend herself and occasionally bring down small game. What she loved most, though, was the evenings. When the day's work was done, she and Pierce would sit by the fire, and they would read together or talk for hours. Sometimes Pierce would tell stories of his years in the mountains, adventures and close calls and moments of transcendent beauty. Sometimes Josephine would read aloud from one of their books, and they would discuss ideas and themes late into the night, and sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. Winter came hard and fast to the mountains. Snow fell in heavy blankets, transforming the world into something pristine and beautiful. Pierce taught Josephine how to move through the snow, how to stay warm, how to read the signs of an approaching storm. They were snowed in for days at a time, but Josephine never felt trapped. Instead, those storm-bound days became some of her favorites, cozy and intimate in their enforced isolation. Christmas arrived with 10 inches of fresh snow and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. They had no fancy decorations, no elaborate meal, but Pierce surprised her by presenting her with a gift he had clearly worked on in secret. It was a bookshelf, beautifully crafted from pine, with carved details along the edges. "Thought you might like a proper place for your books," he said, looking almost shy. Josephine burst into tears, which alarmed Pierce, until she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him soundly. "It is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." She had made him a new shirt from fabric she had brought from town, and though the stitching was imperfect and the fit not quite right, Pierce wore it proudly. "Best shirt I have ever owned," he declared, and she knew he meant it. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Pierce began talking about his plans to expand. He wanted to build a trading post, a place where other trappers and mountain men could stop for supplies and company. It would be set up near the trail, about a quarter-mile from their cabin, far enough for privacy but close enough to manage. "I have been thinking about this for years," he told Josephine as they worked together repairing traps in preparation for spring trapping season. "But I never had a reason to do it before. Now, with you here, with your skills at managing accounts and organizing things, it actually seems possible." "I think it is a wonderful idea," Josephine said enthusiastically. "You could provide a real service, and it would give me something productive to do while you are out checking your trap lines." They spent the spring planning and preparing. Pierce felled trees and began the slow process of construction, while Josephine drew up plans for inventory, pricing, bookkeeping systems. When other trappers came through, as they occasionally did, Pierce would talk up his plans, and several men expressed interest in having such a trading post available. "You're going to make this mountain your own little empire," one grizzled trapper named Jacob teased. "Got yourself a wife and a business, all in 1 year. That is ambitious, Oakley." "Just building a life," Pierce replied, his hand finding Josephine's, "one that suits us." By midsummer, the trading post was finished. It was a solid structure, smaller than their cabin but well built, with shelves along the walls and a counter where Josephine could conduct business. Pierce stocked it with basics: ammunition, tobacco, salt, flour, dried beans, sugar, coffee. Josephine created a meticulous inventory system, tracking what came in, what went out, what needed to be reordered. The trading post proved successful almost immediately. Word spread among the trappers and mountain men of the region, and they began stopping by regularly. Josephine discovered she had a knack for this kind of work. She was fair but firm in her dealings, kept exact records, and treated everyone with respect regardless of how rough they appeared. The mountain men, in turn, treated her with something approaching reverence. Most of them were solitary souls who rarely saw women, and they appreciated Josephine's straightforward manner and her refusal to judge their lifestyle choices. She became known as the fairest trader in the Huachucas, someone who would give an honest deal and extend credit when a man was down on his luck. One evening in late summer, a trapper named Samuel stopped by just as Josephine was closing up the trading post. He was older than most, somewhere in his 60s, with a face that looked like weathered leather and eyes that held decades of wilderness wisdom. "Can I help you with something?" Josephine asked politely. "Just wanted to say something if you do not mind." Samuel shifted his weight, looking almost uncomfortable. "I've been trapping these mountains for near about 40 years. Seen a lot of folks come and go, try to make a living up here. Most do not last. But you and Oakley, you have got something special going." "Thank you," Josephine said, uncertain where this was leading. "Thing is, I heard the stories before I met you. Heard from folks down in Sierra Vista about how you could not keep house, how you were not fit to be a proper wife. Made me curious to see what kind of woman Oakley had married." He smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "I got to say, those townfolk do not know a damn thing worth knowing." Josephine felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That's kind of you to say? Ain't kindness, just truth. You cannot keep house the way they think a woman should, but that does not matter up here. What matters is you are smart, you work hard, you treat people fair. And you make Oakley happy. I have known that man for 5 years, and I have never seen him smile the way he does when he talks about you." Samuel tipped his hat. "Just wanted you to know that. Town folks may not value you, but up here in these mountains, you are exactly what you should be." After he left, Josephine stood in the trading post as evening shadows lengthened, thinking about his words. She had spent so much of her life feeling inadequate, feeling like she was failing at the fundamental tasks of womanhood. But up here, with Pierce and the life they had built together, she did not feel like a failure. She felt capable and valued and needed. She walked back to the cabin to find Pierce preparing dinner, and when he looked up and smiled at her entrance, she felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly staggered her. This man, this strong, gentle, impossibly kind man, had seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up, had given her a life where her actual skills mattered more than her lack of domestic prowess, had loved her not despite her flaws but as a complete person, flaws and gifts alike. "Something on your mind?" Pierce asked, noticing her expression. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," Josephine said softly. Pierce set down the spoon he had been using and crossed the room to pull her into his arms. "If anyone is lucky, it is me. I was content before you came along, but I was not happy. I did not even know the difference until I met you. Now I wake up every morning excited to see what the day will bring because I get to share it with you. Even though I cannot cook or keep house properly, especially because of that." Pierce tilted her chin up so she was looking at him. "If you were the kind of woman who cared about perfect biscuits and spotless parlors, you would not be happy here. You would not be happy with me. We fit, Josephine, because we both know that there are more important things in life than meeting other people's expectations." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Josephine melted into him, marveling at how something she had once dreaded, being touched by a husband, had become one of her greatest sources of joy. That night, as they lay together in the loft with moonlight streaming through the window, Pierce said quietly, "I have been thinking about something." "What is that?" "About expanding the cabin, adding another room or two, making this place a real home for the long term." He paused. "Maybe for a family eventually, if that is something you would want." Josephine's heart skipped a beat. They had not discussed children, both of them so focused on building their life together that the subject had not come up. "Are you saying you want children?" "Only if you do. I am happy with just us if that is what you prefer. But if you think you might want little ones someday, I would like that. I think you would be a wonderful mother." "Even though I cannot cook or keep house?" Josephine teased gently. "Children need more than clean floors and perfect meals. They need love and guidance and someone to teach them that the world is bigger than the narrow boxes people try to force them into. You would be brilliant at that." Josephine thought about it, imagining small children running through the clearing, learning to track animals with Pierce, learning to love books and numbers with her. "I think I would like that," she said finally. "Not right away, perhaps, but someday." "Someday sounds perfect." Fall came again, painting the mountains in gold and red. Josephine's first full year in the mountains was drawing to a close, and she found herself reflecting on how completely her life had changed. A year ago, she'd been miserable and lonely, convinced she was a failure at everything that mattered. Now she was happy, purposeful, deeply loved. One afternoon in October, as Josephine was working in the trading post, she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see a small group of riders, and her heart sank when she recognized them. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Pemberton, and Mrs. Tucker, along with two men she did not know, were picking their way up the mountain trail. Josephine stepped out onto the porch of the trading post, wiping her hands on her apron. She had not seen these women since her wedding, and she had not missed them. "Mrs. Oakley," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "what a surprise to find you here." "This is my home," Josephine said evenly, "and my business. What brings you all this way?" "We were concerned about you," Mrs. Pemberton said. "We have heard stories about this trading post, about you running it alone, dealing with rough men. It does not seem proper." "My husband and I run this trading post together," Josephine corrected, "and the men who trade here are no rougher than any others. They are simply trying to make a living." Mrs. Tucker was looking around with obvious distaste. "You're living all the way up here, miles from civilization, from church and society. How do you stand it?" "I love it," Josephine said honestly. "This is the happiest I've ever been." The women exchanged glances that clearly said they thought she was deluded. One of the men, who introduced himself as Mrs. Henderson's nephew, visiting from back east, spoke up. "We thought perhaps you might want to return to town. Surely you miss proper society, real shops, other women to associate with." "I do not miss any of those things," Josephine said firmly. "I have everything I need right here." "But what kind of life is this?" Mrs. Henderson pressed. "Living in a rough cabin, running a trading post, barely scraping by. You could come back to town, find proper work, maybe even meet a suitable man to marry, someone civilized." "I am already married," Josephine reminded her, "to a man I love more than life itself, and we are not barely scraping by. We are quite successful, thank you." Before the women could respond, Pierce emerged from the tree line, carrying an elk he had shot over his shoulder as though it weighed nothing. He was sweaty and disheveled from the hunt, his hair loose around his shoulders, every inch the wild mountain man. He stopped when he saw the visitors, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Company?" he asked, his voice neutral. "Ladies from town," Josephine said. "They came to check on me." Pierce's expression made it clear what he thought of that. He dropped the elk carcass and walked over to stand beside Josephine, his large hand coming to rest on the small of her back. The gesture was possessive but also protective, and Josephine leaned slightly into his solid presence. "My wife is doing just fine," Pierce said, his tone polite but with an edge of steel underneath. "But I appreciate your concern." Mrs. Henderson eyed him with barely concealed distaste. "Mr. Oakley, we were just telling your wife that she is welcome to return to Sierra Vista any time she wishes. Surely you can see that this is no life for a gently bred woman." "My wife is exactly where she wants to be," Pierce said, "and she is thriving here. But if you are concerned about her welfare, you are welcome to see for yourself how we live." He took Josephine's hand and led the way toward their cabin. The visitors followed, and Josephine could hear their murmured comments about the rustic setting, the isolation. But when they entered the cabin, the commentary faltered. The interior of the cabin was not fancy, but it was clean, organized, and comfortable. The bookshelf Pierce had made for Josephine stood against one wall, filled with volumes. A colorful quilt that Mrs. Willis had given them as a wedding gift covered the bed in the loft. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, and the scent of the stew Pierce had started that morning filled the air. "This is lovely," Mrs. Tucker said, sounding surprised. "My wife has made this place a home," Pierce said proudly. "She keeps the trading post books in perfect order, manages our inventory better than any system I ever had. She has learned to preserve food, to track weather patterns, to defend herself if needed. She is one of the most capable people I have ever known." "But can she cook?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "Not particularly," Pierce said with a shrug, "but I can. And she does 100 other things that matter more. Up here we value practical skills over arbitrary standards of propriety." Mrs. Pemberton looked at Josephine with something that might have been pity. "But surely you must miss having other women to talk to share domestic concerns with." "I have my husband," Josephine said simply. "He is my best friend as well as my partner. I have more meaningful conversation with him in a single evening than I had in months of church socials in town." The visitors stayed for perhaps another half hour, asking questions and making observations that revealed their fundamental inability to understand the life Pierce and Josephine had built. Finally, they took their leave, riding back down the mountain trail as the afternoon shadows lengthened. After they were gone, Pierce pulled Josephine into his arms and held her tight. "I am sorry. I know having them here was not pleasant." "It was not," Josephine agreed, "but it was also clarifying. Seeing them again, seeing how narrow their view of life is, made me realize just how much I have grown. A year ago, their opinions would have devastated me. Now they simply bounce off. I know who I am, and I know what my life is worth." "And what is it worth?" Josephine pulled back enough to look up at her husband's face, at the gray eyes that looked at her with such love and admiration. "Everything. It is worth everything, because I am living it with you." Pierce kissed her, and for a long moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, to the love they shared and the life they had built together against all odds. Winter came again, this time with Josephine fully prepared for its challenges. She and Pierce worked together seamlessly now, their routines so established that they often needed no words to coordinate their efforts. On Christmas morning, Josephine surprised Pierce with news that made his eyes go wide with wonder and joy. "I am fairly certain I am with child," she told him, watching his face carefully. "If my calculations are correct, we should have a baby sometime in late June or early July." Pierce let out a whoop that probably startled every animal within a mile radius. He picked Josephine up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully, as though she had become fragile overnight. "Are you well? Do you need anything? Should we get a doctor up here?" The questions tumbled out of him in a rush. Josephine laughed. "I am fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Mrs. Willis gave me a book on the subject, and I have been reading it. We have months to prepare." "A baby?" Pierce said wonderingly, placing his large hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Josephine felt well overall, though she tired more easily than usual. Pierce treated her like spun glass, constantly worrying that she was doing too much. Josephine bore his hovering with amused patience, understanding that it came from a place of love and concern. As spring arrived and Josephine's belly began to swell noticeably, they made preparations. Pierce built a cradle from pine, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Josephine sewed tiny clothes with her imperfect stitching, frustrated by her continued lack of skill with a needle, but determined to do this for her child. Mrs. Willis came up to visit in May, bringing gifts and offering to stay when Josephine's time came to help with the birth. "You are blooming," the older woman said approvingly, looking at Josephine's radiant face. "Marriage and motherhood clearly agree with you." "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," Josephine admitted. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe this is real." In late June, as the mountain meadows burst into flower and the days stretched long and warm, Josephine went into labor. Mrs. Willis had arrived 2 weeks earlier and took charge immediately, sending Pierce out to fetch water and boil linens and generally stay out of the way. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Pierce paced outside the cabin, nearly wearing a groove in the ground, until finally, just as the sun was setting, he heard the thin wail of a newborn. He burst through the door to find Mrs. Willis holding a tiny bundle and Josephine propped up in bed, looking exhausted, but triumphant. "You have a son," Mrs. Willis said, carefully placing the baby in Pierce's arms. Pierce looked down at the tiny red face, the miniature fingers curling and uncurling, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "A son," he breathed. "Let me hold him," Josephine said softly, and Pierce crossed to the bed to carefully transfer the baby to her arms. She looked down at their child with such love that Pierce felt tears sting his eyes. "What should we name him?" Josephine asked. They had discussed names for weeks but never quite settled on one. Now, holding his son and looking at his wife, Pierce knew. "Thomas. Thomas James, after both our fathers." "Thomas," Josephine repeated, smiling. "Thomas James Oakley. It is perfect." Thomas was a healthy baby who nursed well and slept in reasonable stretches, for which Josephine was profoundly grateful. Pierce was a devoted father from the first moment, constantly holding the baby, talking to him, showing him around their mountain home, even though Thomas was far too young to understand. "You are going to spoil him," Josephine teased, watching Pierce pace the cabin at midnight with Thomas snuggled against his broad chest. "Cannot spoil a baby with love," Pierce said firmly. "He should know from his first breath that he is wanted and cherished." As summer turned to fall and Thomas grew from a tiny newborn into a more substantial infant, Josephine marveled at how completely he fit into their lives. She had worried that motherhood would be another arena where she would fail, but she discovered that, as with so many other things, the reality was different from what she had been taught to expect. She might not be the most organized mother, might sometimes let the cabin get messy when Thomas was particularly fussy, but she loved her son fiercely and learned to trust her instincts. Pierce continued to be an involved father, taking Thomas with him on short trips to check nearby trap lines, showing him the woods and mountains with a reverence that made Josephine fall in love with her husband all over again. One October evening, when Thomas was 3 months old and sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Josephine and Pierce sat by the fire as they had done countless times before. Pierce was cleaning his rifle while Josephine worked on mending one of his shirts, still producing imperfect stitches but no longer caring. "I have been thinking," Pierce said, glancing over at her. About what?" "About how none of this would have happened if you had been the kind of woman those Sierra Vista ladies wanted you to be. If you had been able to keep house perfectly, if you had fit into their narrow definition of what a woman should be, you would have stayed in town. We never would have met. I would still be alone in this cabin, and you would be miserable trying to live up to impossible standards." Josephine set down her mending and looked at him. "Where are you going with this?" "I'm saying that I am grateful for every burnt biscuit and crooked seam, grateful that you were exactly who you were, because it brought you to me." Pierce set aside his rifle and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "You cannot keep house the way the world thinks you should, but Josephine, you keep my heart. You have kept it from the moment I met you, and you will keep it until the day I die. That matters more than any spotless floor or perfect meal ever could." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. "Those women in town used to say I would never find a husband because I could not keep house. They made me believe I was worthless. They were fools who could not see what actually matters, and I am grateful for their foolishness because it meant you were still free when I found you." Pierce wiped away her tears with his thumbs. "I love you, Josephine Oakley, not despite your flaws, but because the entire package of who you are, flaws and gifts and quirks and all, is exactly what I needed. You are exactly what I needed." "I love you too," Josephine whispered. "You saved me, Pierce. You showed me that there was a place in this world where I could belong." "We saved each other," Pierce corrected gently. "I was content in my solitude, but I was not whole. You made me whole." They held each other as the fire crackled and their son slept peacefully nearby, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from their imperfect pieces. Years passed and their life in the mountains continued to flourish. The trading post became increasingly successful, drawing trappers and mountain men from across the territory. Josephine's reputation for fair dealing and meticulous record-keeping spread, and she found herself managing not just their trading post, but consulting with other traders on how to run their operations more efficiently. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler, and then a curious little boy who loved the mountains as much as his parents did. Pierce taught him to track animals, to read weather signs, to move quietly through the forest. Josephine taught him his letters and numbers, fostering a love of learning that delighted her. He was a happy child, free from the constraints and judgments that had marked his mother's childhood. When Thomas was 3, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Emma Rose. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and she screamed with impressive lung capacity from the moment she entered the world. Pierce was just as devoted to his daughter as he had been to his son, and watching him cradle tiny Emma in his massive arms made Josephine's heart swell with love. 2 years after Emma came another son, Samuel Pierce, named for the old trapper who had been so kind to Josephine. Sam was quieter than his siblings, contemplative and gentle, but with a stubborn streak that reminded Josephine of herself. Their cabin had been expanded twice now, with additional rooms for the growing family. It was never perfectly tidy, and meals remained simple rather than elegant, but it was filled with love and laughter and the thousand small joys of family life. The children grew up knowing they were cherished, knowing that there were many ways to be valuable in this world, that arbitrary standards mattered far less than kindness and capability. Occasionally, travelers from Sierra Vista would make their way up to the trading post, and the stories they brought of town life only confirmed to Josephine that she had made the right choice. Mrs. Henderson had passed away a few years back, Mrs. Pemberton right after her. The town continued on, still governed by the same narrow rules and rigid expectations that had made Josephine so miserable. When Thomas was 10, Emma 7, and Sam 5, Josephine stood on the porch of their cabin one evening watching her children play in the clearing. Thomas was teaching Emma how to skip stones in the small creek that ran near the cabin, while Sam collected interesting rocks with intense concentration. Pierce came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different my life is from what I thought it would be," Josephine said softly. "When I was in Sierra Vista, drowning in judgment and failure, I thought my life was over at 22. I thought I would always be the woman who could not keep house, who was not good enough, who would never amount to anything. And now I'm the woman who runs a successful trading post, who raised 3 beautiful children, who built a life with a man she loves in one of the most beautiful places on earth." She turned in his arms to look up at him. "Now I'm exactly who I was meant to be." Pierce kissed her forehead. "You were always that woman. You just needed to find the place where your gifts could shine." "I needed to find you," Josephine corrected. "You saw me when everyone else looked right through me. You believed I had value when I could not see it in myself. Then we are even, because you did the same for me. You took a lonely mountain man and gave him a family, a purpose beyond just surviving. You made my life full of meaning." They stood together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Their children's laughter filled the air, and smoke rose from their chimney into the clear mountain sky. It was not the life anyone in Sierra Vista would have predicted for Josephine Carter, the girl who could not keep house, but it was perfect in every way that mattered. As the years continued to pass, Pierce and Josephine grew old together in their mountain home. Their children grew up strong and capable, each finding their own path in life. Thomas became a guide, leading hunting and exploration parties through the mountains. Emma, to everyone's surprise, developed a talent for healing and became known throughout the region for her knowledge of medicinal plants. Sam followed most closely in his father's footsteps, taking over the trapping business and expanding it even further. All 3 children married and had families of their own, and Pierce and Josephine's cabin rang with the voices of grandchildren during holiday visits. The trading post remained successful, now run primarily by Sam and his wife, but still bearing Josephine's organizational systems. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Pierce took Josephine back to the waterfall where they had first really talked, where he had first shown her that there might be a different kind of life possible. They were both grayer now, with lines etched by years of mountain weather and a life lived fully, but their eyes held the same love that had brought them together all those years ago. 20 years, Josephine marveled, holding Pierce's hand as they sat on the flat rock by the pool. "It has gone so fast." "Best 20 years of my life," Pierce said. "Every single day with you has been a gift." "Even the hard days?" "Especially the hard days, because we faced them together." Pierce lifted her hand to his lips. "I meant what I said all those years ago, Josephine. You cannot keep house, but you keep my heart. And that is all I have ever needed." Josephine leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him that had been her anchor for 2 decades. "Those women in town were so certain I would never amount to anything, because I could not bake proper biscuits or keep a spotless home. They measured worth by the wrong standards. They did. But I am grateful to them in a strange way, because their rejection pushed me to leave, to take a chance on something different. If they had accepted me, I might have stayed, might have kept trying to fit into a mold I was never meant to fill. I would have missed all of this." Pierce pulled her closer. "The world is full of people who will try to tell you there's only one right way to live, only one definition of success. They are wrong. There are as many right ways as there are people, as long as you are living with integrity and love. You taught me that, Josephine said softly. You taught me to value myself for who I actually am, rather than who I'm supposed to be. Then that makes us even, because you taught me that solitude was not the same thing as fulfillment, that letting someone in, building a life with a partner, was not weakness, but strength. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the waterfall, to the birds singing in the trees, to the wind moving through the pines. This place had witnessed the beginning of their love story, and it would always be special to them. More years passed, and Pierce and Josephine grew old with grace and gratitude. Pierce's hair went completely silver, and his powerful frame gradually became less imposing, though he remained strong and capable well into his 70s. Josephine's dark hair lightened to iron gray, and her face creased with smile lines earned from years of laughter and joy. They still lived in their mountain cabin, though their children worried about them being so isolated as they aged. Pierce and Josephine always waved away the concerns. This was their home, the place where they belonged, and they had no intention of leaving it. On a cool autumn evening when Josephine was 72 and Pierce 75, they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done thousands of times before. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren had just left after a large family gathering, and the cabin was quiet again. "Tired?" Pierce asked, noting the way Josephine leaned against him. "A little, but it is a good tired, the tired that comes from being surrounded by family and love." She squeezed his hand. "We did well, Pierce. Look at what we built, not just this cabin or the trading post, but the family, the legacy. We did very well indeed." Pierce kissed the top of her head, "and it all started because you could not keep house, and I did not care." Josephine laughed, the sound lighter and freer than it had been in her youth. "She cannot keep house, every woman clucked. But you said I could keep your heart instead, and I have, Haven, not I? Kept it safe all these years?" "Every single day," Pierce confirmed. "You have been the keeper of my heart from the moment we met, and you will be until we both leave this earth." "And even after," Josephine said. "I believe that. I believe that whatever comes next, we will face it together, just as we have faced everything else." They sat in peaceful silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled and another answered. The mountains rose around them, eternal and beautiful, the same peaks that had witnessed their courtship, their marriage, their entire life together. Pierce and Josephine lived for several more years, their love deepening even as their bodies gradually weakened. When Pierce finally passed away at the age of 81, he did so peacefully in his sleep, with Josephine holding his hand. She grieved deeply, but without regret, knowing that they had been blessed with a love that most people never found. Josephine lived another 2 years after Pierce's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the cabin she and Pierce had made into a home. On the morning she died, her daughter Emma found her sitting in Pierce's favorite chair by the fireplace, a peaceful smile on her face, and one of their old poetry books open in her lap. At her funeral, attended by what seemed like half the territory given how far her reputation had spread, her eldest grandson stood to speak. He told the story he had heard many times growing up of how his grandmother had been judged and found wanting by the narrow-minded women of Sierra Vista. How she had been told she would never amount to anything because she could not keep house, and how his grandfather, a mountain man with the soul of a poet, had seen past those surface judgments to the remarkable woman underneath. "My grandmother taught all of us that there are many ways to be valuable in this world," he said, looking out at the gathered crowd. "That the measure of a life is not in perfect biscuits or spotless floors, but in love shared, challenges overcome, and the mark you leave on the people around you. She could not keep house, but she kept my grandfather's heart, and she kept all of our hearts too. And that legacy is worth more than all the perfect parlors in the world." As Josephine was laid to rest next to Pierce in a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking their mountain home, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the peaks in golden light, and if you listened carefully, you might have heard laughter on the wind, the sound of two souls reunited, ready to begin the next part of their journey together. In Sierra Vista, where the story had begun so many decades earlier, an old woman who had once been a young girl watching Josephine struggle heard about her death. She thought back to those days, to the cruel whispers and harsh judgments, and she wondered, not for the first time, if perhaps the women who had driven Josephine away had lost something precious. If perhaps the real failure had been theirs, not Josephine's. But up in the mountains, in the cabin that still stood strong and solid, Josephine's grandchildren gathered to sort through her things. They found meticulous ledgers documenting decades of trading post business. They found books with margins filled with notes in two different handwritings, Pierce and Josephine reading and discussing together across the years. They found letters from trappers thanking Josephine for her fairness and kindness. They found photographs of a woman who grew more beautiful as she aged, her eyes shining with contentment and joy. And they found, tucked away in a wooden box, a small bundle of dried wildflowers from a long-ago wedding, a hand-carved bookshelf in miniature that Pierce must have made as a prototype, and a single page torn from a book of poetry. On it, in Pierce's strong handwriting, were written the words, "She cannot keep house, but she keeps my heart. That is all that matters. That is everything." The grandchildren looked at that note and at each other, and they understood. They understood that what their grandparents had built together was not just a successful business or a physical home, but a testament to the idea that love finds its own path, that two imperfect people, rejected by a world that could not see their value, had found each other and created something perfect in its imperfection. The trading post continued to operate for another generation, run by Josephine and Pierce's descendants who had inherited her business acumen and his practical wisdom. The cabin remained standing, cherished and maintained, a monument to the life that had been lived within its walls. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moved through the pines just right, people swore they could hear laughter echoing from the mountains, the sound of a man and a woman who had defied expectations, who had built their own definition of success, and who had loved each other with a devotion that transcended time itself. In the end, Josephine Carter Oakley's story became legend in the territory. Not because she had learned to keep house or had conformed to society's expectations, but because she had not. Because she had found the courage to be herself, to value her actual gifts rather than mourning her supposed failures. Because she had found a man who loved her for exactly who she was, and together they had built a life that proved there are many ways to measure success, many paths to happiness. And if the moral of the story was anything, it was this: the standards by which the world judges us are often arbitrary and narrow. Real value lies not in meeting impossible expectations, but in finding where you belong, who you belong with, and having the courage to build the life that makes your soul sing, regardless of what the clucking voices might say. Josephine could not keep house, but she kept Pierce's heart, and he kept hers. And in the end, that was not just enough, it was everything.